Now let's turn our attention to what may possibly be your favorite subject, sex. Now that I have your attention, we're really going to talk about the reproductive system. Oh, how boring. Here you'll need to study models, diagrams, and to be able to trace an egg and a sperm. Let's start with the female reproductive system first.
Turn to page 839 of your text
and open the model photos on the Q drive. Your objectives for the reproductive system are all found on page 36 of your lab objectives. The photos on the Q drive help you study all of the parts of the female models in lab. The flow is basically from the ovary to the oviduct to the uterus to the vagina and out. We're assuming an egg doesn't get fertilized here. Let's study the details of the tracing of an egg. Egg production starts in the ovary,
which you can see in the diagrams on page 841.
Inside the ovary are follicles, and inside of each follicle is a developing egg, or ovum, or oocyte. All the same thing, egg, ovum, and oocyte. Starting at the primary follicle, the egg begins to mature, developing more at the secondary follicle, and then maturing in the vesicular follicle, sometimes called the Graafian follicle. We'll study what happens at each follicular stage in the egg and the process of meiosis in more detail during our lecture. Here we're just looking at the anatomy. It is from the vesicular follicle that ovulation occurs. What's ovulation? Well, that's when the egg leaves the ovary, beginning its journey towards fertilization, or not. Maybe we're hoping the not part more than the fertilization part. Upon leaving the ovary, the egg is technically in the abdominal pelvic cavity, but is usually actually surrounded by the fimbriae, which are finger-like extensions of the oviducts. The fimbriae help guide the egg into the fallopian tube, and the egg passes through the ampulla and into the uterus. Now, what would happen if that egg went out into the abdominal cavity and got fertilized? What if sperm were there? This can sometimes take place, and it would be called an ectopic pregnancy. Normally, the egg is fertilized, though, within the oviduct, and then continues on its journey to the uterus, where it will implant. We're going to look at what happens to the egg when it doesn't get fertilized, though, so we're going to follow its journey to the outside environment. Notice that during ovulation, the follicle doesn't leave. It's only the egg that exits the follicle. What happens to the follicle? Well, it stays behind in the ovary and can become the corpus luteum, the yellow body, or the corpus albicans, which can produce structures or hormones within the ovary. We'll learn about that during the pregnancy stage when we talk about more about this in lecture. So following ovulation, the egg will enter the fimbriae and go through the oviduct and end up in the uterus. Now, looking on the models and the slides on the Q drive, you can see that there are three parts to the uterus: the fundus, or upper dome of the uterus, the body, and the cervix, or the opening into the uterus from the vagina. In the next slide, you can see the vagina and its parts. The fornix is at the top of the vagina and surrounds the cervix. Next is the vaginal canal with rugae. Remember the rugae in the stomach? Well, there are rugae here, that rough layer which allows the vagina to stretch, just as the rugae in the stomach allowed the stomach to stretch. Finally, the egg, if not fertilized, will exit the vaginal orifice, pass by the labia minora, the clitoris, and the labia majora to exit the female body. You can find the complete tracing of the egg on the Q drive, and you need to memorize that.